The Israel Defense Forces has got to operate inside Rafah, and it's got to operate inside Rafah with the same conclusive goals as it has done in Gaza City, as it has done in Jabalia, as it has done and continues to do in Khan Yunis. There is absolutely no sense whatsoever in this completely artificial red line that has been drawn around two aspects of the war. The first is a calendrical aspect, the idea that we should not be making war inside the Gaza Strip during the month of Ramadan. This is completely artificial, it's complete nonsense. Everybody should note and appreciate the fact that no deference was shown to the Jewish calendar when Hamas stormed across our border during the festival of Simchat Torah, where the Jewish people celebrate the receipt of the Torah, of the Bible from Mount Sinai. Murdered 1,200 people. This is a number that seems to be fading into the background, but I want to place it back onto the foreground. Murdered 1,200 people, kidnapped 240 others, are holding 134 inside their dungeons and their tunnels to this day. Our hostages are languishing. And quite frankly, the timeline along which we operate in order to bring those hostages home, whose lives hang in the balance every day, and given particularly the fact that the UN investigation into sex as a weapon of war determined that our female hostages were not only likely raped on October 7th by Hamas and gang raped by Hamas on October 7th, but also are even more likely to still being raped and sexually abused inside Hamas captivity now. Given those considerations, I don't think that we have any requirement whatsoever to be deferential to the calendar of, frankly, any people when it comes to achieving our primary goal here, and that is to bring our hostages home. So yes, we have to operate in Rafah. We have to do so extensively. We have to do so powerfully. And I believe that we have to hold the Rafah crossing in perpetuity once we take control of that area, because so much of what took place on October 7th was facilitated by the bringing in of contraband, personnel, even military know-how from the Sinai Peninsula via the Rafah crossing or another crossing that's just adjacent to the Rafah crossing, and then into the Gaza Strip. Hamas terrorists moved from the Gaza Strip into the Sinai. They then traveled up to Lebanon, then to Syria, then to Iraq, and then to Iran. And they were trained along the way by Iranians. And then they came back in the reverse of that route, back through the Sinai Peninsula into the Gaza Strip, and then launched this massacre against the people of Israel on October 7th. So we're going to have to take that town, and we're going to have to hold that crossing. The Prime Minister of the State of Israel started to deliver truckloads, hundreds of truckloads daily to Gazans through the crossings, the various crossings, particularly Kerem Shalom crossing and others, so that famine, starvation, a humanitarian catastrophe would be avoided. And incidentally, it has been avoided. The stories about mass famine and mass starvation, those don't seem to be backed up by facts or evidence. The most recent article that I read about that number was that there were approximately 20 children who were being treated for malnutrition at this time. Certainly a very difficult circumstance, but by no means mass famine by any stretch of the imagination. Now, the Prime Minister did that and started to move those aid trucks in revolt of what the Israeli people felt needed to happen at that time. I want that to be very, very clear. It was done as a nod, if you like, to the demands of the Americans. The Americans said, we will continue to supply you with all of the material that you need in order to prosecute this war against Hamas. But we need a humanitarian gesture. And the humanitarian gesture was the inflow of food and nourishment to the Gaza Strip. The Israeli people, in the majority of cases, were not in favor of that. They were not in favor of that because they said, well, if we're going to show a humanitarian gesture by delivering aid, let Hamas return that with another humanitarian gesture, namely allowing our hostages, our loved ones, our men, women, children, unborn children, to come home to the state of Israel. Hamas, of course, has not acceded to that. There's no parallel or parity to be highlighted whatsoever in terms of humanitarian gestures. And the delivery of aid is complex. It's difficult. It's not the job of the Israel Defense Forces to deliver that. It's actually the job of other aid communities to do so. It is the job of Israel to allow the aid into the Gaza Strip, the Prime Minister having affixed that as one of the objectives in an ongoing manner during this war. But once it's inside the Gaza Strip, different aid organizations should be distributing that to the Gazans. The problem right now, and surprisingly, is that Hamas is interdicting that aid, is storming that aid, is plundering that aid, and then, of course, is using it to prop up its fighting machine and using it in order to blackmail the civilians inside the Gaza Strip. We saw an example of just how complex this is. You know, there was a headline about IDF soldiers having to repel a storming crowd of Gazans who were running towards an IDF stronghold around the delivery of food by way of one of these convoys. And I believe that the IDF said that we killed about 12 individuals. It's complex, it's complicated, it's not easy. But of course, they had no choice other than to repel this crowd storming towards them. I dread to think what would have happened if that crowd had laid its hands on our soldiers. The Americans, in response to that complexity, decided, among other things, to airdrop food into the Gaza Strip. One of those deliveries promptly landed at the top of the heads of Gazans and killed 3 of them. So this is not easy. And anybody who believes it easy knows nothing of war. I am somebody who believed that after October the 7th, we ought to have actually downgraded to the greatest possible degree by way of an aerial campaign Hezbollah's aerial capabilities, not in terms of an air force, they don't have an air force, but in their airborne munitions. You know, Hezbollah is in a situation where it has the capacity to fire 2,000 munitions upon the state of Israel for at least a period of 100 days at any time of its choosing. We cannot live with that type of threat. We cannot live with that type of reality. And in actual fact, we're not living with that type of reality because 80,000 of our residents have been evacuated from the northern border and the area adjacent to the northern border because the threat from Hezbollah is so very profound, immediate, clear, and present. Now, one of the things that used to concern me about a conflagration between the Israel Defense Forces and Hezbollah was that our forces were not battle tested. So you had Hezbollah combating ISIS for a period of years. And I was always concerned that given that Hezbollah was becoming more and more battle tested and battle hardened, once it came to them facing down our 18-year-old conscripts, they might have more victories than one would want to see in face-to-face combat situations. I don't believe that that's any longer the case. I think that our forces are now, due to very unfortunate circumstance, waging a war following the atrocity of October the 7th, they are now very, very battle-hardened. They're very battle-tested. They're very capable fighters. They've shown themselves to be very capable fighters. And I think that that should now be moved before the end of this time where we are at war against these enemies. I think that ability should be moved northward. And I think that we should massively downgrade, as I said, Hezbollah's capabilities from the air. But then I think that we do have to push Hezbollah back. And I'm afraid that's going to involve a ground incursion into southern Lebanon. Everybody's talking about a diplomatic resolution. There's no diplomatic resolution to be had with these people. There's already one that's on the table. It's ignored daily. It's called Resolution 1701. It is not adhered to. The only way that we can bring quiet to our northern front is to move by way of a ground incursion into southern Lebanon in a very, very determined fashion. And I think that we're well prepared to do that, despite the rhetoric that may be coming from certain international quarters. I think that we must do everything that we possibly can in order to bring our hostages home. They have been languishing there for far too long, 171 days already, since being abducted during the most brutal and murderous rampage against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And I think that bringing them home is vital to our war goals, but also destroying Hamas's military capabilities is vital to our war goals. And so I think if we need to have a temporary pause, not a ceasefire, and certainly not a long-term ceasefire, but a temporary pause in order to bring our hostages back to their loved ones and to their countries, we would do well to avail ourselves of that possibility. But then we must also ratchet up the war machine and move forward to crush, destroy, and eliminate Hamas's military capabilities. It's vital that we do that.
A ceasefire can begin immediately with the release of the first hostage. And so we must put pressure on Hamas to do just that.
I am not surprised by the uptick in anti-Semitism for two reasons. The first is a personal reason. I lived through this. As I mentioned earlier, I was born and raised in Leeds in the United Kingdom. I went to university at the University of Manchester during the events of the Second Intifada. Now, the Second Intifada, for people who aren't aware of it, was a wave of Palestinian homicide bombings against innocent Israelis, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, incidentally. And it became very clear to me as I was in my capacity of a student campaigner at that time, that regardless the number of buses that were blown apart, regardless the number of Israelis who were murdered in the course of undertaking the perfectly ordinary and mundane, from the professor to the student, from the elected official to the voter, from the professional to the layman, there was near total unanimity lined up, at least in public, behind the idea that the state of Israel had no right to defend itself, and that it was responsible for the horrors that were wrought against it. Seeing that multifaceted anti-Semitism, I resolved that I would move to the state of Israel, and I promptly did so after graduating from my studies there. There is nothing new under the sun. The fact that the international community will condemn Jewish people for defending themselves and will attack Jews wherever they may be for the policies, including the righteous, virtuous, and justified policy of making war against a terror organization that has committed an atrocity against our people. The fact that we're seeing that is not new, but it's also unique. For example, were China to have a horrific policy inside its country, to draw a distinction, as I said, I believe that our policy against Hamas is wholly just, but were China to have a particularly appalling policy or an unpopular policy inside China, you would not have Brits attacking anybody who appeared to be Chinese inside Britain. Were Pakistan to have an appalling policy inside Pakistan, you would not have Brits attacking those of Pakistani descent inside the borders of Britain, because of the policies of the Pakistani government. And the list goes on and on and on and on. There is an exception to that rule, and that is the attitudes of people towards Jewish citizens of the diaspora countries. Only in that case do you see a situation wherein the people of Britain, the people of America, the people of Denmark, the people of France say the Jewish state is enacting a policy of which we do not approve. We will therefore vilify, torment, traumatize, and pursue you Jews here in Britain, you Jews here in America, you Jews here in France. It's an appalling double standard, but it's not new. And I also want to talk about something on a macro scale. The reason that people have become absolutely unmasked and even proud of their hatred towards Jewish people inside Western democracies, the most troubling area in which this is happening, is quite simple. The Jewish diaspora can never be stronger than is the Jewish state. The strength of the American Jewish community can never supersede the strength of the Israeli Jewish community. The strength of the Anglo-Jewish community can never supersede the strength of the Israeli Jewish community. And on October 7th, what these anti-Semites in Western democracies thought, mistakenly, was that finally the Jewish state was on the ropes. They thought that they might be seeing the dismantling, the beginning stages of the dismantling of the one and only Jewish state. That emboldened them to attack the members of the Jewish community in their countries, because they believed that given that the Jewish state of Israel is vulnerable, the Jewish people in other countries are also vulnerable and are there for the taking. And much to their disappointment, the state of Israel is battling back and showing that far from emitting the death cries of its own demise, it's actually roaring back with what one would say is something akin to the roar of the Lion of Judah, proudly saying that those who would deny our right to exist here will not be allowed to enact their heinous crimes against our people. This is our place, this is our home, and we will defend it, and we will protect it, and we'll do so very, very successfully and with great bravery and courage. I also want people to be aware of something when it comes to who we're fighting against. There's much talk about the disproportionality of Israel's response inside the Gaza Strip. You know, on October 7th, as I mentioned earlier, 1,200 Israelis were murdered in the space of one day by way of an invasion by Hamas into the state of Israel. Now, the war has endured for 171 days. By that notion, if you take the 1,200 Israelis who were murdered in one day, that shows you that across the 171 days, if Hamas was given its will, 205,200 Israelis would have been murdered by now. That's the level of murder with which Hamas is comfortable. Now, the state of Israel should not and does not compare its actions in a war zone to the standards of Hamas, of course. But the international community, who seems so ready to defend Hamas, should be very, very aware of the standards of that terror organization. Were they to be given free rein and the ability to kill and murder in an uninhibited fashion, they would have by now, according to their own standards, have murdered 205,000 Israelis. That's something that everybody should be very concerned about.